Welcome to the Okereke Scene. I'm Bistra, you know that already. And should I say jingle bells, jingle bells? I'm just, this is a joke, you guys, but if you're watching this, you're probably watching this from your homes and it's already like Christmas time. I cannot believe that. So, because of that, I already told you that from time to time we would have foreigners and lots of artists that speak English as well. And that are interesting mostly. So my next guest, he's a poet, he's a translator, he's a teacher, he's a journalist, he's like so many things. And without further ado, I would like to present to you Tom Phillips, who also translated my poems. So I'm very excited to have you here.
Oh, thanks, Peter. It's lovely to be here. Yeah, it's great. Thank you for inviting me.
How are you feeling in general?
In general, all right. Yeah, fine.
Yeah?
Yeah. It's, been interesting times, but,
So tell us what's popping.
Well, I mean, I've had just a really strange, busy time. I've discovered like with writing, I seem to have finished quite a lot of things. But that's not because I'm insanely inspired. It's just that I keep starting things and they go on for years and then they kind of all sort of end up finishing around the same time. So
but you finished them. You do finish them.
I say finished, Can you ever be sure? I don't know.
Well, no, not really. But I mean, I think by finished, I mean like a finished product. You can never be finished, I think, because I feel like even when you write a book, I feel like there's a second story after the book that people sometimes maybe do not get to read.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Yeah, I mean, there are sort of all the stories which are around the story that you haven't actually mentioned or told fully, or all those little things that probably only you can ever know,
All right. So what I do usually with guests, doesn't matter who, doesn't matter when and how, but I like to take them back to their childhood, because I'll tell you why. As an artist myself, I've always felt as if at some point, maybe you have some gifts and talents before you were born, or when you were born, you were already born with some gifts and talents. But I feel like at some point in time, and sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's not. At some point in time, something clicks for a person. And that person decides to either write, paint, act, sing, doesn't matter, to basically explore himself through the act of creating something. So I feel like taking you back in time, did you have one moment where you realized that you would like to, let's say, write? Was writing the first thing that you got into?
Yeah, I think it was. I did have piano lessons as quite a youngish child. And I would say I was kind of moderately okay, but I could see I wasn't going to be, a concert pianist, put it that way.
Beethoven.
Yeah, it was a bit obvious. But I think what it was if I think about it, my mother was a great lover of books and the theatre, actually.
Wow.
And so there were always kind of books around, and I learned to read at quite a young age. And she encouraged me to do that. And I don't know why, but at some point I wrote a kind of silly poem. I think I was about 11 years old. And it was about Christmas.
Wow.
Funnily enough, it was about, I don't know, I think it was a sort of thing about, a sort of jokey thing about how, like what kind of dreadful presents people get and that kind of thing. I can't remember exactly. But my mum really liked it and she made me read it out. They had a kind of party for their adult friends. And that was a sort of little show. And I read this poem and I thought, God, this is a great way to show off. So I think it started from that. And I did write a couple of others for other parties that my mum and dad had. And then I was too young to really think of myself as a writer. But, then it's kind of teenage years. And, I grew up in the kind of 1970s.
Wow.
So all the whole punk rock thing was happening. So everyone was like, anyone can pick up a guitar and write a song, attitude. And so there was a lot of that. And I sort of was writing songs with my friends, and we had little bands and stuff. So
You're from Bristol, right?
I wasn't originally, actually. I
Really?
was from, no, I was originally born in a town called Aylesbury, which is near London. I mean,
Okay.
it's famous. It's quite, what's it famous for? It's where David Bowie first performed Ziggy Stardust. That's its big claim to fame. And so I grew up and went to school there, and so it's very boring, actually. It's the home counties, southern England, kind of very middle class, very middle of the road. And, but fortunately very close to London. So that was cool. But no, I moved to Bristol when I was about 20.
Oh, wow.
21, 22.
Wow.
Yeah.
You were grown up by then.
Yeah, I just left university basically, and Sarah, who's now my wife, and I were just looking around for somewhere to live, and we thought, oh, we'll go to Bristol because she had family nearby, and we'll stay there for 6 months or something, and then go to London. And of course, we ended up living there for 30 years. So,
Wow.
yeah.
I mean, talking about plans and how we plan life, I feel like at every point, life shows you that you cannot make plans. I mean, usually life laughs at you and is like, okay, you made a plan, but this is not my plan for you.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
You either accept it or not.
Yeah.
You can do whatever with my plans. I'm just letting you know you're not in control of life.
Yeah. I know. I mean, I've experienced that a lot, these kind of sudden sort of abrupt changes, which I just wasn't expecting. And so that's been really interesting.
So at that time, would you say that parents or your parents were approving of what you were doing? Like at the point where you decided to do poetry or write, were they approving? Did they like the fact that you decided to do something like writing? Because, I mean, come on, it's a profession that doesn't earn money, or that's the saying.
Yeah, I mean, I only found this story out later, but apparently when I was at secondary school or high school, in effect, I had to choose which subjects I'd specialize in my last 2 years at school, in the sixth form, as they call it in the UK. And I just wanted to do English, obviously, and by then I kind of thought, I think, okay, I'm going to take this writing seriously. And this caused a kind of scandal, which is too strong a word, but the headmaster of the school didn't want me to do arts subjects.
You're kidding.
No, because I was equally good at science subjects, and they wanted me to go to university to study science because they claimed it would be easier for me to get in to university. And I just said no.
You're kidding.
Yeah, no, this kind of thing used to happen back then. Honestly, it's just terrible. And so I didn't know this, but my mother found out about it. I must have told her. And she went into the school and she just basically told the headmaster, he's doing English or he's out of here. Not that it would have made any difference. It was a state school to the school, but so she really did stand by me, which was just fantastic. I think my dad was actually an engineer, and I don't think he actually understood what I was doing at all, ever. But he was never hostile to it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so nice.
Yeah, it was lovely. I mean, it turns out, I didn't know this again at the time, but a lot of my mother's ancestors were involved in the arts and so on. So I guess there was that. She'd been brought up in that kind of environment as well.
Do you think that affects us and maybe we do not realize it, or we realize it at some point, maybe later in life, or I don't know, do you think it affects us a lot, like what our grandparents did or great-grandparents?
I don't know. I mean, I sort of instinctively don't want to think of sort of being artistic as a kind of gene, like something that's explicable that way. But I think there must be the ways in which these things are kind of communicated to us through just the simple behavior of, well, initially our parents, I guess, and then beyond them the grandparents, and then the way they've been influenced by their parents and so on. So I wonder whether it's more that kind of, that's the way it's passed on. But I think I'm becoming increasingly interested in that, what that is. And maybe when I found out all this stuff, I can trace my family back to the Elizabethan era. And
so lucky.
I know. I mean,
so lucky.
I'm really lucky because the records are all there now and they're really easy to access and online and stuff. And there's a lot of connection with the art world in general. And I just wonder,
what's up with that?
Yeah. And now I know it. It's like, it's okay. It's really okay for me to do what I do, because look at all these people before me,
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so interesting, because nowadays I feel like I think about it a lot, because my mom is not an artist. My dad is not an artist. My dad was a professor teaching building construction, architecture. And then my mom did economics. And then my grandmother did economics. And then my grandfather did economics. So I'm like, where am I in this picture? But at some point, I even found out that my dad, he used to perform. And he also writes lots of books. Like a couple of years ago, like some years ago before he passed away, he got to publish his own book. And in the book, he actually shared some of the performances that he used to do. And I'm like, oh, wow. That's when I knew, because I didn't know at any point. And it was weird because, like, for example, my mom, she's Bulgarian and my dad is Nigerian. So if you actually know these cultures very well, you would think that my mom would be the one supporting me, and then my dad would be the one, saying that this is not how I would earn money. It was quite the opposite, actually.
Right.
It was my dad who was always supporting of what I do, and he was like, if you want to be an artist, go for it. And he actually thought of it, like he believed what he said, and my mom was like, no.
Right.
And I'm like, wait a second, what is going on?
Yeah.
But anyways, I'm just like thinking about how much of what we are is based on people that came before us.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I'm increasingly interested in that relationship and all the other, all the kind of experiences that they had and the kind of different circumstances that they lived in. And, I know that my ancestors have gone from being actually very, very wealthy to being absolutely impoverished.
Wow.
Really serious changes my mum, my mother's mother, my grandmother, she can afford the rent half the time, and they used to have to run away from, that kind of thing. This would be in the 1930s. But her grandfather, that's what my great-great-grandfather, lived in a kind of really large house in central London and had lots of, was a very successful businessman. So it's really that kind of thing I'm interested in. And my mother came from a sort of collapsing, almost aristocratic family, almost, but not, but certainly upper middle class. And my dad came from a very poor background. He came from a farming community, and they didn't even have farms. They just had small holdings, what we call, and so his family was sort of outwardly mobile, and my mother's was down. So all that as well. There's the whole social thing, and I wonder how that has affected.
But England is quite, I would say different from the Balkans, very much so. But anyways, we'll get there.
Yeah.
So you went to Cambridge, yeah?
Yeah.
What did you study?
So again, I studied English literature.
Okay.
So in those days, that was a sort of, the first 2 years was just, you started in 1300 and you worked your way up to the present day sort of,
That's a lot of information.
It is. It was madness, really, when I think about it now. But I mean, it was really interesting and comprehensive, really. You got a really solid picture of sort of English literature over those, well, it was 600 years at that time. And, but yeah, that's really where I got serious about writing, because I was really, really lucky. Completely by chance, I got, we used to have to do these classes in, it's called practical criticism. And basically what happens is they give you a poem or a short piece of prose. They don't tell you who wrote it. And you have to write something about it. So you have to analyze it without knowing who it is. Now, sometimes you get lucky and you think, I know who this poem is, who's by, but a lot of the time you didn't. So I was doing this, and I was the teacher for that course was a guy called Peter Robinson, who's was then a very young junior teacher at the university. And I don't know why, but one day he just sort of leant across the desk and said, actually, Tom, do you write poems yourself? And I knew he was a poet by this point. So I said, yeah, actually, sort of rather shy, usual. I'm sure you've been there.
I do know.
Yeah. So sort of the next week, I kind of produced this little kind of scrappy pieces of paper and sort of pushed them very shyly over the desk and sort of ran out of the room and just thought, oh. And he was very kind. And one of them, he just said, no, that's rubbish. And I said, okay, fair enough. And the other two, he said, no, you could write, you can write, basically, or you're showing the signs of it. And so from then on, he was just really like my mentor.
Wow.
And helped me sort of develop various skills as a writer. And in fact, I think he probably the first person to actually publish anything I wrote in a magazine that he was editing. But it's been great because we've been friends for life. I mean, he's still a very good friend of mine, and he taught me when I did my PhD many, many years later. So,
you know what I'm thinking about? At that point in time, I feel like it was so different to be a writer than right now. Like right now, you can be a writer and be so many other things. Like let's say you can work at a bar and also have a day job and also write and so on and so on. But at that point in time, I feel like you couldn't do a lot of things at the same time. Or am I wrong?
No, I suppose not. I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think you even back then you would. I mean, certainly if you're a poet, you would need to have a day job. But you'd probably have to have, you'd be expected to have like a career.
Yeah.
It's like as a
writer.
No, as something else.
Okay.
Like you'd be a teacher, or you'd be a journalist or something, but not this kind of, what do they call it? Not like this kind of gig economy, which is, I think, what you mean.
So that hasn't changed, maybe.
Not really. I mean, I've always had to do loads and I've been freelance for most of my career. So yeah, you name it, I've done it basically in journalism.
So
anyway.
At what point did you start working at a radio station?
That was immediately after I left university. Nearly. As I say, that's after I moved to. So after university, I moved to Bristol.
Yeah.
And in those days, they had this brilliant scheme called the Community Programme, which was to help people who were unemployed by basically giving them training in specific different areas of work. And you got paid while you were doing this by the government, which sounds almost impossible these days, but that was the way it was. And I qualified because I'd been out of work for 6 months. I think you had to be. And I applied for this radio scheme because it said, you need good writing skills.
Okay.
And I hadn't thought about radio at all. I mean, didn't really know much about it, really, or certainly not how you made it. And so they trained me in how to, make radio programs and whatever. So I worked there for about 10 years, which is fantastic. So, but it was all analog equipment, so nothing like this. It was like real to real tape recorders, which, You know, they were like
Interesting.
weighed about 12 pounds, and you had to have them on your shoulder all day. And kind of,
Interesting.
yeah. It's
Wow.
very different. Very different.
What do you think that experience gave you?
That was brilliant because I mean, that was all based. It was a local radio station, so it's the BBC's station in Bristol. So we had focused on life in the city, but I was working for something called the Social Affairs Unit. Sounds very important, but it wasn't really. But we used to do these nice little documentaries. So we'd actually just go and meet just everyday people and talk about their lives and sometimes, usually, perhaps a small problem or major problem that they were facing, whether that was a certain, there was quite a lot about healthcare, quite a lot about poverty, about education provision and all those kind of social issues, but through ordinary people's lives. So I just got to meet all these fantastic, really interesting people and hear their stories. So I think that's where it was really,
Do you think that as a writer, you have to actually be able to live life and not write from your own room, let's say, and imagine all these worlds that, okay, I mean, some writers do it, but also I feel like maybe you get to write about life when you experience life yourself. If not, then what you're writing is not based on,
Well, I think I'm a bit of a realist when it comes to writing. So I think that ties in with what you're saying, this kind of idea that, nearly everything that I write, certainly in poetry and prose fiction, comes generally from something that's happened really to me or that I've heard about from someone else. So that kind of idea of sort of just writing from your room isn't really where I'm, the kind of work that I do. I tend to wander around a lot, and I have to admit that I listen to people on public transport a lot.
Of course, we all do it.
Yeah,
come on, it's so
but
interesting.
I'm doing it for artistic purposes. See,
Yes.
So it's allowed.
I feel like as an artist, you have to be very curious to people and to be curious about life and places and events and maybe history a little bit. Not we're not historians, but maybe to be curious about what happened and why it happened the way it did, and so on and so on. If you're not, then I feel like, it shows.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. And I'm very interested in place as well, and like how all the stories about any place, no matter how obscure it is, even if it's just a crossroads in some tiny village or something, that all the stories that kind of overlap. So, in that place and who might have been there and so on and so on. So that's the kind of work I'm really interested in, I think.
Okay, so then from the radio station, you went to do some journalism, yeah?
Yeah, I switched to print journalism. Again, it's one of those things that's completely by chance. Okay, so the radio station, I'd actually stopped working there at that point, but they still kept me on as a theatre critic. So I very occasionally, I'd be sent to the theatre and I'd have to get up at some awful hour in the morning and go on their early morning show and say,
really?
Yeah.
That's awful.
It was really cruel. I'd be in the theatre until 11 o'clock at night and they want me in at 6 the next morning and, to be able to speak coherently about something.
That's awful.
Anyway, it does, but I just happened to be at one play and this woman who I kind of knew anyway, just because she had dealings with the radio, she was a journalist on this magazine called Venue, which is like an arts and entertainment magazine, like a bit like Time Out and City Limits and those kind of things. And Shirley we got on really well anyway as friends. And she just said to me, do you want to write some reviews for us? So I said, yeah, that would be great. I'd much rather do that, because you go to the theatre and you don't have to write the review until the next day, or maybe even 3 days later if you're lucky. And so I started doing that. And the editor of the magazine really liked what I did. And so I slowly sort of got into writing for Venue, and that was great. It was like, I spent 17 years there.
Wow.
And I was, again, I ended up editing some of the sort of sections, like the art section and the theatre section. And I was a sub-editor, correcting other people's copy. And eventually I became the overall editor of the magazine for a short time. And it was really varied. And again, it wasn't so much meeting sort of what was great there was you're meeting an awful lot of artists of all kinds and interviewing them. And, I got to meet some fantastic, really interesting people.
At what point did you start publishing?
My own work?
Yes.
In magazines, actually quite from just after the time I was at university.
Okay.
So I was doing this all along. So all during this radio and print journalism bit, I was kind of writing poems, little poems, and kind of sending them off. And I was getting some quite nice reactions. And so just in magazines, in those days, they were actually on paper and, and what have you. And then there was a kind of a bit of a gap, mainly because we had children, which kind of put a stop to having a great deal of spare time, let's say. And I don't really, that was fine. And so I didn't really write much that was any good between about, I think, for the first sort of 5 years of the 1990s. So I sort of around the time I was coming up to 30.
But we also take breaks, no?
Yeah.
As artists. I feel like, for example, people ask me a lot, when are you going to publish your second book? And I'm like, I didn't publish my first book because I wanted to publish a book. I published it because I already had lots of things to say and add.
Yeah.
And, it's not like I'm planning my next book to be next year or the year after. I don't feel like I'm a writer. Like, I'm an artist before that. Like, I do lots of things, and sometimes writing is not my priority. And sometimes I write because I want to write. And mostly I write because I want to say something that happens and comes from life.
Yeah.
So it's not like I plan, okay, tonight I'm going to write 3 brilliant poems or 3 brilliant stories. It's not like that.
Yeah.
You feel inspired by life, something happens to you, and then you feel like you want to say something based on your experiences, no?
Yeah. Exactly the same experience for me. And I think maybe, I think actually having a break away from it was really actually good for me at that point. And I kind of didn't really have a lot to write about for one reason or another. I was just busy.
Does that make you feel like you're not an artist?
I always, this is imposter syndrome, isn't it? And now I even earlier this year, because I've published 3 collections of poetry.
Wow.
And a couple of small pamphlets and things, but only really 3 books. And, I kind of, I think, here am I teaching creative writing, and it's like, who am I to do it? And so I actually emailed this friend of mine I mentioned earlier, Peter Robinson, and said, I really feel a bit, I said, I'm really not I don't feel like I'm qualified or that I'm being a writer. And he kind of was really kind and wise, as he always is, and came back to me and just said, it's fine. Don't worry. You've published when you want to publish. Your work is being continually published in magazines and so on. And he said, well, I actually feel I've published too much. There are some books, I think I've just put books out too quickly sometimes. So I think you're right. I mean, I think it's got to come like kind of naturally, really, when you think you've got a book there.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're saying this, and then you have writers that they actually plan their next publishing and everything, and they're like, okay, I have 2 years to publish a book, and so on and so on. So we have the other, cases of people that do it the other way. But for me, it's not like, especially with writing, It's not something that you plan. Yes, of course, if you're a professional and that's all you do, you practice and you read and you live and so on. And maybe then you get to, okay, let's say you want to write just for practicing twice a week. Maybe, okay. But then I don't think you can plan life. So I feel like books and, art products and plays and so on, they're not planned. You cannot plan them. That's my opinion, at least.
Yeah. I mean, I think also there's a lot of, there are a lot of things that, I personally find anyway, there's a lot of ideas and things that I just start and then reject and think, this isn't actually right. Or I don't want to commit to this or whatever. I mean, it's fine with a poem. It's not much of a commitment, as it were, in time. But if it's a play or something, it's...
So, yeah, I wanted to ask you, because you've written lots of things and you've used different instruments to do it. So what would you say is different? Let's say you write a lot of poetry and you have written theater plays. So what would you say is different about all these different forms of writing for you, at least?
I think it's interesting. Because I sort of went back to poetry in the mid-90s because performance poetry had kind of come along at that point. So there was a lot of sort of gigs in, in pubs and places, and sort of very completely different from when I even only the 10 years previously. And I kind of got into that scene quite a lot. And I was doing a lot of what they now call spoken word poetry. And that was great. That was great fun. I mean, it's like being a stand-up comedian, really, basically. Well, it wasn't my case. And then I started writing plays around that time. So I was obviously getting interested in performance, I guess you'd say. And it was funny because the sort of material that I was putting into the performance poems was actually starting to suggest itself as plays instead.
Wow.
So because then I published a book of poems, and I can remember this guy who reviewed it very kindly for me for another Bristol magazine. So the opening line of his review of something is, you'll be familiar with Tom Phillips because he stands up on stage and shouts and gets angry and tells satirical jokes. So if you read his book, you'll be absolutely astonished because these are sort of quiet lyrical poems about, the countryside or whatever, And so he said, well, I met him afterwards and he said, well, what's happened? And I said, well, I think all that sort of energy, that stuff about having something I really want to say has kind of gone into the theatre plays now, if you see what I mean. So it's like there was a different...
The energy has moved from one place to another.
Yeah. So it's like I never quite know how something's going to end up. Do you know what I mean? It's like it could start as a poem.
Wow.
But then that might end up not going somewhere. So then it might become the starting for an idea for a play or for a short story or something, or vice versa. Or, they seem to all interlock like that. And I never kind of, well, you were saying about, you don't sit down and think, oh, I want to write 3 poems about, no. I have the same thing. I don't kind of sit down and think, oh, I want to write a poem about this, or I want to write a play about that. I sort of have to test out some idea and see where it's going to end up.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Because for me, it's not like that.
Right.
I only write poems.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm lazy as a writer. I don't know if everybody is, or it's just me. I don't know. But I feel like I love poetry because it's short and you have like one page of one story and you don't have to like get into the details of the story, and then you don't have like a very definitive beginning, middle, and and I love that. I love playing with the short form of words. That's my thing. And then with theater, for me, because I'm an actress, I feel like theater plays is somewhere I'm not sure I'll go, and if I go there, I feel like there will be a lot of self-criticism because I'm an actress and I know how to perform. So I would know what not to do. So it's going to be like,
I wonder, I think you might, but do you think you'd be too self-conscious about it?
Yes.
Because you're an actor. I think it's quite good to be, because when I've worked with two kind of main types of theatre production. One was with what we call a community drama group in Bristol. So, i.e. people who don't get paid, frankly. But it means that they do it because they love it, but and as a hobby, really. And so, but you can write these plays with huge casts, like 30 characters if you want, which you can't do in professional theatre because no one can afford it,
Wow.
So that was one type. But then I work with a number of different professional companies where I'm down to like 3 actors if I'm lucky, And but it was very interesting, sort of not really feeling part of the professional theatre world because I hadn't sort of come up working through it. I felt that distance was actually quite good. And so I'd be with nearly all the companies, I'd be actually in on rehearsals with them. And I think that was really, I was kind of speaking a slightly different language to them, if you know what I mean. So I think it was a great learning for me, but I think it was also quite useful for
because I feel like as an actor, you do have to read somebody's words. And if you get to work with somebody that is alive, that means that they get to question what you've written, because now they have to be the character you've already written about. So instead of writing about it, now you have to, see it come alive. And for them to do their job, you have to have done your job very well.
Yeah.
Because if not, that's not going to work. So I feel like if I start writing theater plays, it's going to be lots of complications there. Like I would have the 2 points arguing against each other.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I mean, I'm just thinking about the writers I knew, back in Bristol when I was and the theatre. There were actors and actresses who wrote really good plays, but they were nearly always one-person shows for themselves.
Wow.
For themselves, thinking about it, I can't.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think maybe they were aware of that.
Yeah.
That's sort of what you've called that kind of conflict.
Because writers, they write whatever they want to write about, and they write it however they want to write it. So they do not, seek the approval of the actors or whoever is going to perform it. So when you have that, and when you're the one that might perform it, end up performing it, it's like you get into your own trap.
Yeah. I mean, although it is an interesting, I have actually done a one-man show, which was kind of really interesting because I'm not really an actor. I have done a bit, amateur and so on. And I was given a really great professional director to work with on this piece. And it was really just a storytelling piece. It was a little bit theatrical, but mainly really me just telling a story. And I said to Andy, the director, we had 2 days of rehearsal. It was only a script in hand performance anyway. I said, you've got 48 hours to give me like 3 years of drama school.
Whoa.
And he said, no, I haven't. And I went, what? And so it was really interesting because we just sat, he just, for about the first half day, we just sat and talked. Yeah. And I thought, when's he going to start directing me? And
you're already doing the work.
He was already doing it. And I didn't know.
You didn't know.
Because he was getting me to re-engage with the passion why I wanted to tell this story, So it was really.
So I'm interested. At what point did you hear about the Balkans or any kind of Balkan country?
Okay, well, it's actually intimately connected with that one-man show.
Wow.
Yeah, because the show it was called very imaginatively, I Went to Albania. Okay, so, and this is because, where are we now? 18 years ago, our kids just said to Sarah, my wife and I, why can't we go traveling? Because we'd said that we'd been traveling before they'd been born, and we traveled around bits of Europe on the train. And said, why don't we go around Europe on the train? And I said, yeah, great. Okay. So, you can get these Interrail tickets, which mean you can go anywhere for a month or whatever for a fixed price. And so we set off. And I said, well, what we will, even though by then it was 17 years after the Berlin Wall had come down, I'd never really been to Eastern Europe at all, ever. And so I said, well, let's try. Well, so we started in Prague and kind of was just sort of going around. And then, we didn't really stick with Eastern Europe entirely. I mean, we ended up in Italy, and we were trying not to plan anything actually in line with this little theme of planning and so on. And anyway, we ended up in Albania, and this is 2006. So we arrived, and things were still pretty grim there then. Even,
I've never been.
It was about 15 years after the communist period ended there, and communism was like really manic there. I mean, it was completely cut off from the rest of the world because they didn't agree with the Soviets, they didn't agree with the Maoists, so they were just on their own, and it took a long time to recover. And we had actually sort of mentioned Albania as a possible place we'd go before we left. And a friend of mine said, what are you doing that for? He said, I'm going to, he just thought the country was full of gangsters and that we'd just end up on the news, like idiot British tourists go to Albania and end up, killed or kidnapped or whatever. So I said, don't be ridiculous. It's not like that anymore. No, it's like 2006, for goodness sake. So we got on this rather rusty ferry in Bari in Italy, and it went overnight, and we arrived in Durrës, which is the main port in Albania. And as we came in, we thought, yeah, it does look a bit run down, to be fair. And we found out we were the only tourists on the entire boat, because tourism, Albania is now a huge tourist destination, but back then it wasn't.
Yeah.
And, because they asked all the foreigners on the boat to go and get their passports checked early. So we all had to queue up in front of this rather fantastic guy behind a little table in the bar of the ferry. It was hilarious. And we were the only ones. There were, I think, 3 other foreigners who were German, and they were evidently there on business from what they were talking about. And so, and especially with 2 children, we have a child of 7 and 13 with us. We've all got backpacks on. We stand out a mile, look, absolutely. And so we got off the boat, and then and they have a system of hiring people in the docks, and this is first thing in the morning there, which is very similar to the system that used to work in Bristol, funnily enough. And basically just people turn up at the dock gates at 8 o'clock in the morning or wherever, and, they try and get the foreman's attention on the other side of the fence so that he sort of goes, I want you, and the rest of you can go home. So that was all going on. So you can imagine there's a lot of noise because there's a lot of people shouting, trying to get work. My kids are like looking, and so I said, don't worry, it'll be fine. And we sort of walked out of the gates and were immediately kind of swamped by just people because, there were people there, loads of people selling probably
drugs.
No, well, counterfeit cigarettes, rather
contraband,
dubious looking material, legal products, but possibly of illegal origin, if you know what I mean. And also people begging, and the kids had never encountered that. They were just like, they were latching onto us because we were quite obviously Western and quite obviously, mad, I expect they thought. And anyway, somehow we sort of parted the sea of people and came out on a street, and it was completely ordinary then. There were just people walking past with briefcases and kind of it could be anywhere. And there were people just going to work and everything. And it was just this area around the docks where people who were really desperate, I mean, that's the truth, had gathered like they do in many countries, actually. But anyway, so I really needed to find a bank because I needed to get some Albanian money because you can't get it outside Albania. So, and we saw one. And the Anglo-Albanian Bank, I can remember it, and it looked very modern, and whatever. So we sort of went down to it, and there was a sort of revolving glass door, and a security guard stood outside it, and he refused to let in Sarah and my children.
Why?
And my rucksack. Well, because they were just security. They were, I don't know. I mean, they just would only let me in. And he sort of, I said, okay, yeah, whatever. Sarah said, oh, don't worry, it doesn't matter. We'll just wait on the street. I said, yeah, I'll be fine. And
will you?
Yeah. And I went inside and thought, it occurred to me that I don't speak a single word of Albanian. And I thought the chances of anyone speaking English were quite low. I mean, I didn't know what to expect. Anyway, the woman behind the counter was, of course, completely fluent and was really helpful and changed some money for me. It's only about 50 euros or something, but just enough to get us to and I said, look, we want to get to the capital, Tirana. And she said, well, how do you want to get there? And I said, well, ideally by train. We love trains. And she said, well, he said, the railway station's just over there. There's a train in about 15 minutes. I said, oh, great, perfect, super, thanks. And I went out and sort of went back to the door. And I went out through the revolving door, and there was a flight of steps down to the pavement. And I suddenly realized that there were three men in leather jackets pointing Kalashnikovs at Sarah and our two kids.
No way.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, and there was a battered BMW had kind of pulled up at speed on the pavement, I thought, great, that mate of mine who says we're going to be on the news is just right. Here we go.
Way.
I thought, I've got 50 euros in Albanian money, in my pocket. That's no way you're going to pay off, and my Sarah and Lydia, my daughter, were just like absolutely pale and just sort of stood there like this. And only my son, who was 7, Sam, was happy, and he was going, look, Dad, real guns. And I was going, and there was just, it can't have lasted long. It can only have been a split second, I think, a few seconds. But all these thoughts were going through my head, like, oh, God, I've been such an idiot. I should have believed everyone's prejudices and stereotypes. This is not going to end well. And then equally mysteriously, the three guys they took one look at me and they just went, put down their guns and went and leant on the boot of their car and kind of got out for cigarettes and started chatting and everything. I thought, what on earth is going on? And Sarah, brilliant line, just said, sort of, leant round the corner of the wall that she was leaning on, and I'm sort of here. And she said, I think we should go now. I said, yeah, I think so. So he kind of walked off with that sort of horrible feeling of like any minute it's going to be like one of those old war films, we kind of think we were getting away and then we're going to hear a fusillade of bullets and that's it, But it wasn't at all. And actually, that was the only time that anything like that happened. And afterwards, people were so great. I mean, we went to the railway station and...
What a way to start.
Yeah, I know. And and people were giving us bananas and coffee without wanting any money or no, they didn't know what had happened to us. It was just because we were foreigners, really. And by that evening, we were in Tirana and we were in love with it. We loved it. But that story is the story of the one-man show I was talking about, because I then tried to find out what was going on. And eventually it took we went back to Albania several times and I've even taught English there for a while. And eventually a friend of mine I was telling this story to, and he just said, oh, they always do that. I said, what? He said, yeah, it was, what day did you arrive on? I said, it was Monday. He said, what time did you arrive? I said, it's about 9 o'clock. And he went, aha. See, that's when they take the money to the bank. So they were extra security guards, and they had no way. They wanted to get Sarah and the kids out of the way, but they had no way of doing it. So they just did it with Kalashnikovs. So I said, really? And he said, oh, yeah, it's common practice. They want, when the cash comes, he said, that's when the real gangsters are likely to turn up. So they bring in these extra guys. So I said, after all this time, so that's how it all began, really. And in fact, also, that moment it's interesting, isn't it? That moment that seems to be the sort of potentially the worst point of your life, it was actually a turning point. In
what way?
Well, in a big way. Here it comes. Here's the story. So I performed that as a one-man show.
You did?
That whole story. This is what, the I went to Albania thing. But I also performed a little bit as part of a conference on travel writing that a friend of mine organised at the University of Portsmouth in England a few years later. This must have been 2013, actually. And I performed a little bit of it in front of the audience of students and so on. And at the end of the whole event, a student came down to the front and just said, "Excuse me, can I ask you a question?" I said, "Yeah, of course. No problem." She said, "You wrote about Albania. Have you ever been to Bulgaria?" And she was Bulgarian, obviously, evidently. And I actually said, "Well, no, funny enough, we haven't. We've been to nearly all the Western Balkan countries, and we'd been to Romania, but somehow we'd never been to Bulgaria." I think we always just kept, because we do these month-long rail journeys, and we'd always run out of time. We got as far as Brasov in Romania, and we just realized, oh my God, we've got to get back to Paris by, the day after tomorrow. So it was purely chance that had sort of stopped. And so anyway, we got talking. It turned out her sister was a visual artist, and so is my wife, and that her boyfriend at the time was a young writer. So I said, "Oh, this is really, we should keep in touch." And, so we exchanged email addresses. I said, "If you don't feel it's too weird." And so we did. And it turned out that she absolutely hated being in Britain and was really homesick. And to be fair, I have to be careful about what I say. But anyway, her circumstances were not great. She didn't have a great landlord, and there was all sorts of stuff. So we were talking about it as a family. And I said, "Look, why, would you mind if I invite Vasi to come and maybe she can just spend the night with us and get a night away from all this kind of," and she's about my daughter's age. So she came and stayed with us and so on and so on. And then I happened to be coming to, in fact, it was Kosovo that summer to take part in an academic conference. And she said, "Well, that's not far from, come and stay with our family." So to sort of
in Bulgaria,
return the, so
favor, yeah.
Anyway, so I got on really well with her parents, who are roughly my age, and so all the generations were it was great, and so we became really, really good friends as families. And Sarah, I was here on my own the first time, but then the next year, Sarah and Sam came over, and so on. And in the meantime, I decided that I wanted to find out more about what was going on in Bulgarian writing. And there wasn't a great deal in translation then.
Nope.
Not really. And so I thought, well, there's only one way around this. The logical solution is I'll have to learn Bulgarian. So so I taught myself Bulgarian.
This is not how people think.
I know it isn't. And I'm just, I don't know what it is. Something's kind of sort of attached itself to me at this point. And so I taught not with no idea about moving here, which is why my conversational Bulgarian is terrible, because I learned it passively as a translator, really.
Wow.
With the view to translating into English. And so in the meantime, someone found out that I was translating poetry, I think, and that I'd tried writing a bit of poetry in Bulgarian myself at that point. And to keep this short, I ended up being a resident at the Sofia Literature and Translation House. This would be 2016. Is that right? No. Yes, 2016,
yeah,
which, it was a bit of a kind of key year in British history, in that by the time I'd got here,
Brexit, right?
Brexit, the vote had just happened. And so actually, again, I was on my own here that time. My wife couldn't get time off to come and join me, and time off work. And so we were messaging every night, but over the course, I was here for a month, and it went from kind of, we really want to leave Britain, don't we? We want to remain Europeans. And so I said, yeah. And I thought, well, the easiest way to do that is to move to Europe, obviously. And now, and sort of by the end of the month, Sarah was emailing back and going, so when are we moving to Bulgaria then? You know, it was that kind of thing. And it turned out that a woman at the Sophia English translation house who was sort of, I was liaising with most regularly, said, oh, my mum and dad have got an apartment in Sophia. They were looking for someone to rent it.
Wow.
And I said, well, we won't be able to move like now. I can't sort of fly home on Monday and come back, move back on Tuesday. I said, it'll be at least a year or more. And they said, don't worry, we'll keep it for you. So everything, you know, everything was right. So there's that amazing, the sort of thread of events is this kind of weird thing of like being threatened, feeling that you were in danger of losing your life on an Albanian bank steps, you know, to the complete coincidence of there being a Bulgarian student in the audience when I'm talking about the Balkans and her deciding to come and ask me a question, to, like I say, this apartment being available for us. And, you know, so it's been really quite a coincidence.
What would you say was the biggest cultural shock at that time? Maybe not now, but maybe then.
Yeah, you see, I've been asked that question before, and I don't know. You see, I had a slightly strange experience. I'll be honest with you. The second time I came to Sofia, which was in 2014, and that's right. Our friends couldn't put me up that time, so I was staying in a little downtown hotel, one of those little family ones, you know, and again, I'd been in Albania actually teaching. And so Sarah and Sam were going to join me. So I was in Sofia on my own for like a day.
Yeah.
And I was walking around and I just got this really strange sensation that this was home. So the sort of culture shock thing I've always struggled because people have asked me that question. And I think perhaps it's because we got to know so many people before we actually moved here. You know, so we kind of, one of the great things about my residency at the house was that, you know, I had two sort of elements to my job description. Number one was I had to translate something, obviously. And the second one was meet Bulgarian writers. So I spent a month meeting Bulgarian writers. So, you know, had lots of friends already. And so we had lots of communication before we moved. So, and we knew the kind of Balkan Peninsula lifestyle.
But that's interesting what you're saying, because I feel like a lot of people have had connections, but some of them get to experience lots of shocks.
Yeah.
Through the timeline. I feel like, you know, at some points, different points in time, they're like, and what you're saying, it feels like, and it's interesting.
I think that, I mean, it's also difficult because, you know, it's kind of, there are definitely things I don't understand, you know.
What, for example?
Well, I mean, just sometimes the way people react, for example, you know, I've got into terrible trouble in shops every now and then, in like small, tiny shops, you know, like the last one was because I accidentally knocked some little bags of sweets off a stand and with my rucksack.
Yeah.
I was fully intending to go back and pick them up, but I wanted to put what I was going to buy on the counter beforehand, you know, so I had free hands. So I could actually pick. It just prompted this huge tirade from the woman behind the counter. And I just said, I'm going to pick them up. And it didn't stop. You know, I just couldn't stop it, this shouting. So in the end, I just walked out. But, you know, it was that kind of thing. But, you know, I don't know whether that's a sort of culture thing. I think it's just a customer service issue, really.
Which is also a cultural thing.
Maybe.
In Bulgaria.
Maybe. I mean, yeah, I think customer service could perhaps, maybe.
I mean, even to people that speak Bulgarian and that live here, it's like, good evening, nobody.
Yeah.
Have a nice evening, nobody. They're not even like, no nod, no, nothing.
Yeah.
It's like, there's nobody there.
Yeah.
sometimes it's so weird.
Yeah. But I think also, I know that you've made me think of something else is the bit, one of the things about not being Bulgarian. I mean, you know, I can handle Bulgarian conversations in shops and things on that kind of level. I'm quite good about vegetables and so on. But, you know, when we go out, actually, sometimes I think it's an advantage that we're not Bulgarian, so we can pretend to be tourists. And so if something's not quite, you know, right, it's like, oh, we'll just put our finest English accents on. You know.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah. So there are things like that, and but it seemed that, you know, I don't know. I think also what's been nice is that certainly before the pandemic, lots of people came and stayed with us, friends of ours from Bristol mainly, who'd never been to Bulgaria before, never.
From the UK?
Yeah. Really didn't know very much about it.
What did they think?
You see that? I think every single one the most dramatic is my late mother-in-law. God bless her soul, but I have to tell this story really because it illustrates exactly what I mean. And my wife's sister came, and I really think that Jane, my wife's mother, thought that this was somewhere like Kazakhstan geographically. So she was expecting like rolling steps, and quite possibly that I had to go to work on horseback. You know, I really think it was that ridiculous. And and they arrived on a flight quite late at night, I think, because we didn't go to the airport to meet them. They said, no, we'll get a cab into the center, because they were staying in a hotel because our apartment doesn't have a lift, and they both have problems with getting up and down stairs. So they stayed in a hotel downtown. I said, okay, we'll come and meet you at the hotel, obviously, and quite close to the center. We were waiting and waiting. So Sarah was getting a little bit anxious. I think it was like, what's my mother going to think of this, you know? And, you know, so of course they drove right the way through the center, I guess, must have done, you know. And when they arrived, you know, she just said, God, it's really beautiful, isn't it? I thought it was like the whole weight. It's like that, you know, the kind of story of you brought my daughter to this kind of hellhole narrative, which was, I think, was potentially one that I may have had to answer, was disappeared. Oh. So that's the most, and you know, we had other friends. Again, Peter Robinson, the guy I mentioned, and his wife Ornella came, and he said something very interesting. I mean, he said, I mean, we live in a reasonably old neighborhood, you know, in the center, and yeah, I mean, some of the buildings are falling down, and to be honest, and he said, well, it just kind of needs a bit of tender loving care, most of it. And I said, yeah, it's surface stuff, you know, it's just plaster falling off walls and things. And he said, the other great thing I've noticed is that Sofia is really still a city on a human scale. And I thought that was a really interesting remark. And it, you know, I think when you're out in that, I think in the, you know, if you go to the business park or Inter Expo Center or any of those kind of places, it doesn't look like it's on a human scale anymore. There's a lot of glass and steel going up. Yeah. But, you know, down where we live in Oboriste, and then even in the center, even the main buildings are not.
They're not from this century.
No, they're still kind of,
they're stuck in time, maybe.
Yeah, and they're not these gigantic skyscrapers and things, and you know, and I thought, yeah, that's maybe another reason I don't feel, you know, I felt this strange feeling of home. Is that it, you know, it's kind of, it is on that human scale, I think.
Well, since it's Christmas right now, I think maybe I want to wish you happy holidays.
Thank you.
And for you to have a very creative year, you know, to maybe discover some stuff that you didn't know about yourself and the people around you and the world. And just to, you know, have great health. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. I mean, this was it from us. And I have no idea who's going to be the last guest here on the show for this year, but I guess I mean, I'm going to be surprised as much as you are. So, of course, I have to tell you, like, comment, share, and the most important thing is subscribe, because if not for you, we're not going to exist. So I want to wish you happy holidays, Merry Christmas, have some warmth in your heart and in your home as well, and enjoy the holidays. And see you, you know when, next week on Monday, 8 p.m. sharp. Bye.